There is a serious problem with how transactional so much of the online knitting community is becoming, and this bad actor is a really good example of that. Okay, hello all. Welcome back. My name is Sarah. I make knitting videos on the internet, and I'm really excited to talk to you today. So, for the first time last week, I made kind of more of a drama video, commentary video talking about knitting in public and what people think, and I really enjoyed that. I thought it was really fun to get to read a lot of responses from people and hear just everyone's opinions on it. And so I'm back again today to film another, talk about another thing. And I feel like this week is so juicy. It's like a crazy kind of situation where, like, how did someone act like this? Like, the level of entitlement is crazy to me. And I also think it is a really good kind of case study or example to show some trends in the knitting community online, at least more broadly, that I'd love to talk about. So here we are. We currently have Miss Fig off to the side helping us get into this story. She'll probably leave, but we've got a little girl. And yeah, that's let's just get into it. It's kind of juicy. So, as you'll have seen from the title, and you may know about this story because it's definitely very, very popular right now. A lot of people are talking about it. But essentially, this knitwear designer, Korean knitwear designer, his name is Youngman Lee, and hopefully I'm saying that right. I tried multiple times to make sure, but I want to respect that his name is being pronounced correctly. So please correct me if I'm wrong on that. I don't agree with his actions, but he deserves the respect of his name pronounced correctly. So Youngman Lee, also known as Knitting C on Instagram, and then his Ravelry username, I cannot figure out how you'd pronounce it, so I will have it up on the screen. He is a knitwear designer and Instagram influencer. He has about 10,000 followers on Instagram, although I think that has declined quite a bit by now. And he has released patterns in the past and has a close relationship with the yarn brand Woolfolk, which will come into play shortly. But they're a kind of luxury yarn brand that makes I love Woolfolk's yarns generally. They make some really nice, interesting blends of fiber, have really interesting colors, and they're a smaller yarn brand as well. So he has a close relationship with them, and he's a knitwear designer himself. And so Youngman decided, probably, I don't know the exact timeline of everything, it's not all available because so much has been deleted, but a little while ago, he started knitting a sweater that was inspired by Knives Out, which is a movie that came out in 2019. And in that, Chris Evans wears this beautiful white cabled sweater that has inspired quite a few knitwear designs at this point because it is just an iconic, incredibly cabled, white, detailed sweater. And so he started working on a sweater for himself, he said at first, using an existing pattern inspired by the Knives Out movie and that sweater, and another pattern from Woolfolk. And so he started designing the sweater. I'll have like a picture of what he was designing up that he said was, at first said, and everything's translated from Korean. So I hope I'm representing everything right. I cannot read or speak Korean, so everything's translated. But essentially, he said in the caption of this post when he was talking about this design for the first time that he probably cannot release it because of how heavily inspired it was by the Handsome Chris pattern, which is a free pattern inspired by the sweater that Chris Evans wears that is by Karen Schaffer. And so he says in that, I basically just rewrote Karen Schaffer's pattern, which is free, to be top down instead of bottom up, and added set-in sleeves instead of whatever the current sleeve construction is. And he specifically said to make it bottom up or to make it top down and use the set-in sleeves that he used a pattern by Woolfolk called the Pringle Twin Set. And so he basically kind of mashed together two patterns to make a sweater for himself, which I've done, tons of people do, or I'll modify my patterns constantly to, get what I want out of them. Nothing wrong there. But then a few months later, he actually decided to release this sweater as his own design. And he called it the Cable It sweater. And people immediately were like, this is the same sweater as the Handsome Chris by Karen Schaffer. It seems like you just changed the construction, but that the cable motifs are the same, the general look of it's the same. And in the past, you've referenced that you used this pattern to write yours. And so it seemed very unethical to then release that as a design and profit from it, taking away people who would otherwise go knit Karen Schaffer's, and just overall not a great thing to profit off of other people's work. That's like me deciding I don't want to knit a pair of socks top down, I'd rather knit it bottom up, and so I rewrite it bottom up, but everything else is the same and I release it. Like that's not a different pattern, that's just a modified version of an existing pattern. And so people were rightfully upset with him and, commenting on the pattern on Ravelry, saying this is a knockoff Karen Schaffer's pattern, go check out hers, it's free, and just, trying to say this is not right, saying that on Instagram as well. And he just began deleting pretty much all of those, started posting on his Instagram about doing side by sides of the Chris Evans sweater from the movie versus the Cable It, and saying basically a true knitting expert would be able to tell the difference between these, kind of being very passive aggressive, saying they're different, and if you see them as the same pattern, you're just not a skilled enough knitter, and just generally being entitled and being very, very passive aggressive and frustrated with people calling him out. Just a lot about how he was in the right and continued to believe that, but eventually the pattern was taken down by Ravelry. Enough people reported it, and before it came back up on Ravelry, he added a different motif. He changed a lot of the description of the pattern to also add references to different inspirations, to say I was also inspired by the Cocoa Knits method, which is a method for cabling, and inspired by the original sweater. So he then put in like, oh, this sweater by the French brand, the Couples, which is what Chris Evans is wearing in the movie, is what inspired me, not the Handsome Chris. And so he still had a reference to the Handsome Chris sweater, but he really tried to downplay the inspiration and just add a huge list of other inspirations, I think, to kind of like be like, no, it's not just a combination of these two patterns, there's all of this other stuff going into it. And so he edited the description to that, and then he also made a new version of the sweater in which he changed the cable motif to a pretty simple cable motif. And from reading the description on Ravelry now, it's kind of confusing. It seems like you can definitely still access the original motif, which is ripped off from the Handsome Chris. There's a new motif where it's basically like a panel or a section of rib and just stockinette, and then a section of cable. And so it just alternates between rib and cable. So pretty simple. And then it seems like there might also be a version where you can add your own cables into it. So that is kind of cool that a pattern exists maybe where you can go in and add your own cables and kind of design your own cabled sweater. I think probably patterns like that already do exist if I had to guess, but hey, that's not a bad idea for him. But it's still, the base of it is you can still make the rip off of the Handsome Chris from his pattern, and he has never taken accountability for that or taken any sort of ownership of the fact that he did rip off another designer to make his initial version. And so now that pattern is actually taken off of Ravelry again as of yesterday, February 18th. It was removed again, I think, after enough people reported it. And I do also want to acknowledge there's been so many people reporting this and so many people compiling all this information, which has enabled me to make this video because so much has been deleted. So Fox and Fleece on Ravelry and Reddit has compiled so much of this. So a huge thank you to them and those other members of the Crafting Snark Reddit community who have been really compiling a lot of this information, translating things from Korean to make this information known to those outside of Korea as well. So yeah, there's the entire situation with the Handsome Chris ripoff for this Cable It sweater, but we're not over yet. So there's that side of the situation with him doing this. And then parallelly, is that a word? In parallel to him doing all of this pattern theft to write his cablelet sweater. He also got into a lot of controversy with Woolfolk when he released one of their patterns that he'd been test knitting without permission to do so. Like before it was released by Woolfolk, he shared it, this pattern. And so he seems like from reading some of the messages he sent that have been leaked, again translated from Korean, that he was frustrated with Woolfolk, which he'd had a great relationship with in the past, had test knit for them, had received yarn compensation from them and yarn support for designing, and so had done all of that for them in the past. And that's a great deal. I would love to work with a yarn brand like that. And he got to, so he had a very long established relationship with them. And then he was frustrated as he was designing the cablelet with the fact that they didn't want to provide yarn compensation or yarn support for all of his testers, or at least not cover all of the yarn for all of his testers. It seems like there was some sort of discount, but maybe it wasn't enough to cover every single tester or all the yarn every tester would need. And trying to read between the lines, it seems like there's some context missing, but he was frustrated with Woolfolk for whatever reason. Any yarn compensation, I've got to say, is lovely. Like it's nice to be able to offer your testers anything, and it's not really expected a lot of the time. And so being able to offer testers a few free skeins or something to get them started is already lovely. But he was upset because they didn't want to do something, or whatever it was. He was upset with Woolfolk and decided as retaliation that he wanted to release this pattern within his Cablelit test knitters group. And so he sends this message with the pattern. You can see it's the final, it's a screen. I'll have the screenshot up of him doing this where it says the Quinn cardigan final version. And he shares that file, and translated from Korean, he essentially says that he's been really frustrated with how Woolfolk has been doing things lately. And so this is his form of petty revenge, is to share this pattern with his testers. And potentially, I can't find screenshots of this, but some people have alleged that he also put the pattern elsewhere onto other forums. And so that it was available to not just this group of testers, which would still be like 20 to 30 people, or like, I don't know how many testers he had, but at least 10 to 15 people who maybe otherwise would have spent money on the pattern. So you're stealing at least probably $50 to $100. I don't know how much the pattern really costs, but probably closer to at least $100 potentially from Woolfolk by doing that. And potentially more if he shared it with others, or if those folks in that tester group continue to share it out. And the pattern's not even released yet. So not only is he just taking something that otherwise people would have had to pay for it and giving it to them for free, but he's taking away Woolfolk and the designer Hada Knits, or Hana Masijuska, who's known as Hada Knits on Instagram. You're taking away their accomplishment, and they spent all this time and money on designing a pattern. It takes a lot. It's a cabled cardigan. That's a lot of thought into designing something like that and having it professionally tech edited and test knit. It takes a long time, and it's a lot of your. I designed this sweater, and it was a lot of my kind of heart to put into it, because there's this inspiration. You have to find the inspiration, you have to make something in your head turn into reality, and it feels very close to you. Like it feels like a baby, or like an accomplishment of some kind to have done that, and to have that ability to then release it. And they're still releasing it, but to have it kind of tainted by the fact that it's already been released maliciously is just not kind at all. It's not legally allowed, I believe. I mean, I'm not a lawyer, but it seems like that would violate copyright law, because any patterns are copyrighted. And so you're stealing someone's intellectual property, which is legally not great, but then ethically and morally, I just feel like it'd be so sad to be Hana, who has done all of this work on this pattern, and just see it come out like this. And so one of the testers in the Cablelit group did screenshot all of these communications from Youngman, and released them, I believe, just first in Korean media, and then it was eventually picked up and got to Woolfolk. And so Woolfolk understood the situation. They made a post as well saying, this is not tolerable, that it's so hurtful to see this. And so I'll have that up as well. But they did make a statement about it as well. And Youngman's response was be very upset with the tester. It seems like the tester is still not known who it was, but he has some guesses potentially. And so within his test knitting group has been saying things like, oh, this test, whoever released this whistleblower narc must be socially anxious and must not have a social life and must be depressed and must have insomnia and heart issues, and this person better watch out because I have so much proof and so much evidence against them, and just kind of attacking this person who is doing the right thing. I mean, you're breaking copyright law and it's just morally wrong. And so it seems like they were doing the right thing to expose this and say, hey, this is happening. Like, he needs to be corrected for this. This is not ethical, nor potentially is it legal. Again, not a lawyer, but it seems like some potential violations. And so I think that they were in the right, that they were very brave and smart to do that, and a good contributor to the knitting community to say this person is not acting appropriately. This is bad faith actor, and this is kind of degrading our own community trust. And so was attacking that person in that group, and then also on his Instagram stories was attacking the designer of the Quinn cardigan. So Hannah Knits was tagging her in his story with screenshots of all of their email exchanges about the Quinn cardigan, because he was a tester and apparently shared a lot of feedback and was kind of involved in some level of writing, or at least that's what he claims, is that he was helpful writing it, and even said that he did more work on it than the tech editor from Woolfolk. And so just claiming like, I was a really integral part of this process to release this cardigan, and so I was in my right to then release it if I wanted to, because I'm like so involved in it and I put in so much work, and just very entitled to the fact that he did a lot on it, so therefore he can release a pattern that's not his. Like, I don't really get the logic, but it was just tagging her saying, don't forget all of this work I did, and it's just being nasty. And when you do have a platform of 10,000 followers, like, a lot of people are going to see like, okay, this is not an appropriate way to act, this is not okay, or be like, I don't really know what's happening, and just not get involved, or just not go after Hannah Knits. But there is going to be a portion of your audience, when you do have a larger audience, that is very committed and dedicated to you and will go attack people and go, spam their account or bully Hannah. And so I hope that she's okay, because he basically sent all of this, a lot of his followers, her way as well. And I haven't checked in to see what kind of impact it's had on her. It's probably, I imagine she had to delete a lot or filter comments or anything, but I imagine there was some large impact on her own Instagram and her own mental health from people coming after her and talking to her. So it was incredibly irresponsible from him, and he clearly thought that he was in the right, and just clearly is very entitled and very self-righteous through all of this. And so it's always really sad to see that, of clearly this person is acting in bad faith and doing things that they shouldn't be. I mean, rewriting a pattern and then selling it and claiming it as your own, not acceptable ever. Like, that's not a different pattern. To just change the construction slightly is not a different pattern. That's just changing the construction. And many people, like Karen Schaffer, which I'll get into a little bit more, but she wrote an entire Substack or blog post about this experience and was saying, many people have modified the pattern to write it bottom up. If you look through the projects on Ravelry, which there's over 500 of the Handsome Chris sweater, people have made the same modifications that he has before. But they understood that that's not a different pattern. Like I still got all of these cables. I still got this inspiration, the design from Karen Schaffer. I'm using her pattern. I'm just changing the way it's constructed. That's not a new pattern. And so incredibly different. And he then can claim like, oh well, I was inspired by the same sweater in Knives Out. Like Karen Schaffer does not own the Knives Out sweater in the knitting world, which is true. But Karen Schaffer pointed out in her blog post that her sweater is not the only one inspired by the sweater Chris Evans wears. That there are, I think she mentioned 2 to 3 other knitting patterns that are also inspired by this sweater. But the difference is those designers reach out to Karen Schaffer, spoke to her about if they were okay, if she was okay with them releasing a similar design, but that, they all had differences to it. It wasn't like they took Karen Schaffer's pattern and rewrote it to change certain details. It's that they saw the same sweater, wanted to also knit it, and wanted to design something around it because a lot of people really love that sweater. And so they made their own versions. But they are all different, and they all, instead of being inspired by Karen Schaffer's pattern, are inspired by the same sweater. That is totally acceptable and totally fine. There's, limited inspiration in our world. Well, there's a lot, but like in our popular media, the things that we get inspired by are often very similar. And so it makes sense that there would be multiple sweaters inspired by Knives Out because that movie is incredibly popular. And many, many people in popular media have talked about that sweater and how amazing it is. So it makes sense to have multiple interpretations of the sweater available as knitting patterns. It does not make sense to take a knitting pattern, rewrite it slightly, change like the construction a little bit, and claim it as your own. That's completely different. So he first of all did that, and then to also release a pattern that you were test knitting and that people put a lot of trust in you to keep to yourself. It's just so sad to see, and so entitled to then claim that it was in your right because of the amount of work that you put into it. Because I, as someone who has designed in the past and tested it in the past and sample knit, there is a lot of trust that goes into sample knitting and test knitting. You have to really rely that the people you're choosing aren't going to release the colorways if it's, sample knitting for yarn that hasn't been released, or release the pattern before it's done and before you have the chance to do it. You're putting a lot of trust into these people, and it's a lot of, it could have a huge financial impact if someone does release it beforehand, because then kind of this excitement dies down, and then by the time you're actually ready to release it, there's not the same excitement that helps, get some sales for something that you are putting a lot of work into. Designing is a lot of work. Like even a simple stockinette sweater like this one took me months, and I'm a younger designer, so it'd probably be quicker in the future, but it's a lot of work to figure out, it's not only the work that it takes to knit the pattern and work through different complexities, because when you're trying to grade things to different sizes, it becomes very complex of, okay, well, this works for size large, but not for size 2XL, so what can I change? And so there's a lot of that in designing, but there's also just the work and the effort that goes into coming up with ideas, the inspiration that you find, and the kind of, I don't know, I fall in love with every idea I have, and I look for inspiration constantly, and it takes a long time to really come up with something of like, okay, I've seen this sweater, how can I, like commercially, I've seen a sweater like this, what can I do to make it a knittable pattern, and what can I do, like maybe what do I want to modify to make it my own? And there's a lot of care and effort and love that goes into that, and so ripping it off and just releasing something is just not ever acceptable. There's no excuse, there's no, I have a wonderful test knitter, Shay, who I've worked with, who I'll have her Instagram, she's always lovely, who offered to help me tech edit because she's learning to tech edit. I'm a younger designer, and I put a lot of trust in her. She's putting a lot of work into my patterns. She's helping me make sure that they make sense and that, everything is good. And so I trust her a lot. And if she went out and released a pattern of mine, I would be devastated about the amount of work that I put in, about this relationship that I built with this person, and having that trust violated. It would just be absolutely devastating. So there's no world like where that's okay, because yes, Shay has helped me a lot and put a lot of work into my patterns, but I'm still the one that wrote it. I'm still the one that is organizing everything and, organizing test knitters, taking the photos, getting ready to release it, coming up with the ideas. All of that is me. And so I do not want to discredit any of my tech editor's work, of Shay's work, or any of my test knitters' work is incredibly, incredibly valuable, but it is not ownership of the final product. That is ultimately me. And I am always so grateful for everyone that helps me with designing, whether that is tech editing, whether that's just my mom and friends talking to me about a potential design and what they think of the ideas. I'm incredibly grateful for everyone that is involved, but it's my pattern and I've put a lot of work into them. And so if someone then just took that work away and released it and then claimed that they put a lot of work into and therefore it's fine, would be devastating. So I think it's pretty clear that Youngman in this situation is very much a bad faith actor, that he has shown in multiple examples that he is not trustworthy in the knitting community, that he is stealing designs, that he is releasing things he shouldn't be, violating trust, all of that. And so that is pretty obvious, at least to me, and I hope that you can see that as well. And I do hope that Youngman can really realize why the things he's done are wrong and hopefully improve in the future. And I hope that we can see more unique designs from him, because that is wonderful. But based on his current actions and his response to the backlash he's gotten, I don't know if we're going to see that. So that is very sad. But I did briefly also want to, more than just covering the drama and the controversy, and there's probably going to be other videos that give a very detailed timeline because this is such a big event and there's so much happening and it's so interesting. So I imagine there will be other videos that dive a little bit deeper into what is happening when, and screenshots and the exact situation. But I also do want to talk about some of the discourse that came out of this, what people are kind of saying, my own opinions about it. And so I, first of all, found a post or a Substack blog post from Karen Schaffer that I've kind of referenced before, but she wrote a long, I think it's probably about 3 pages if you printed it out, post about her opinions on the situation after someone stole her pattern. And so it's a great read. I highly recommend reading through it. I won't be able to cover everything here, but she essentially talks about how hurtful it was that this happened, that Youngman still has not reached out to her, and she, I feel like, did a really great job of being respectful and being very level-headed through it, not, saying anything really negative about him other than like, I don't appreciate the way he acted here. But she also talked a lot about how she is seeing this connect to other trends in the knitting world, which I agree with. And so she talks a lot in this blog post about how this example of Youngman as someone who has a larger Instagram following, then able to build relationships with yarn brands from that, and he is doing these horrible things. And it sounds like not only there's this situation, which is incredibly bad with the 2 examples I just showed, but he also in the past has been just a negative force, it sounds like, in a lot of the Korean knitting community, that he gets into arguments a lot of the time, a lot about reverse engineering patterns and if that's ethical, and has been known to share patterns, paid patterns before. And so this isn't the first time. And so he has, it sounds like, allegedly, this is, I haven't seen proof of all of this, but this is what I'm hearing from, reading through a lot of Reddit posts, reading through people who've interacted with him and shared their thoughts, reading through all of that. It sounds like he has done a lot of these bad actions before, and yet it took until he did something bad to a yarn brand for there really to be financial consequences for him. Like there have been a lot of people that called him out for the Handsome Chris and the cableette, but the largest thing I think is going to be the Woolfolk, the fact that his relationship with Woolfolk is dead. And Woolfolk sponsored the yarn for the cableette, even though I feel like it's that the handsome Chris sweater is so popular, and I feel like he would have had to share something about how he's coming up with this design, and it should have been obvious that it was some level of plagiarism, but I guess it didn't get flagged to Woolfolk, and I don't know how those systems really work, but I will say Karen Schaffer mentioned that as well of, he had this relationship with Woolfolk while he was still behaving badly, while he was plagiarizing patterns and potentially behind the scenes also releasing patterns, and that he had this reputation behind the scenes for acting badly, but he still had 10,000 followers on Instagram and still was able to work with these yarn brands. And so it's interesting how transactional much of knitting is becoming, at least online, and how a lot of our world, like a lot of worlds that have a social media community, are becoming more based on social media personalities, and those who have large audiences get more, ability to knit things and abilities to work with brands and knit new things and just be exciting and show things. And there's some element of I'm a content creator in knitting. I have the luxury of having the time to sit down and film videos like this. I have the luxury of having nice yarn to knit things that I can show. And so all of that is, a privilege and a luxury, which to some extent is expected, but that it's become another level within the knitting community in some ways of, prioritizing showing beautiful things over community and over being a good knitting community member, I guess. And so it's interesting. It's really sad in some ways because I feel like knitting can still be that very community element thing, but that there is a lot of pressure from the commercialization of so much of knitting, from the fact that so many of us are on social media and doing this on social media, and it's kind of inherently you have to keep up with algorithms, you have to post beautiful things that people are going to interact with. You can't just, show who you are as a person and say, do you want to talk to me? Like, do you want to be my friend online because these are the things I value? Like, that's not really going to help you in the long run to build a social media following, which not every knitter online is trying to build a social media profile, but of course the most popular have. And so we see a lot more of that kind of transactional actions and entitlement afterwards because people have gotten there by posting their beautiful things and had to work with yarn brands and now have an audience where they're like, okay, I've bought all this yarn or worked with all these people to get here and now expect the same thing of, if I'm going to work with someone, it's more transactional. And so just I feel like Karen Schaffer talks about it really well, and I really highly recommend reading her blog post as well because I don't want to just parrot everything she says, but essentially it's sad because so many knitters make beautiful, wonderful things, but don't have the best lighting or are knitting with different yarns and can't really do the pay to play that a lot of social media takes to become a very popular knitter on social media. Is kind of an element of you need to knit with certain trends. Like there's a lot of trendy knitting patterns where you have to buy the knitting pattern, you have to buy the yarn for the knitting pattern. Like not everyone is going to want to or can afford to do that. So there's this element of how much of our knitting world is becoming this kind of pay to play transactional world versus how can we foster more community and connection, because it's so needed. Like test knitting and sample knitting and all of the things that so much of our community relies on to generate new patterns that are well tested, that fit multiple body size, rely on trust and kind of community social cohesion. And if knitting is becoming more transactional, we can't rely on that community cohesion and that trust anymore. And so I feel like it's hard to know where to go forward because social media is so much of everything, and I love seeing what others are making on Instagram, and I love seeing beautiful patterns. Like that's part of the joy of Instagram or YouTube, is to see what beautiful things people are making, but how can we still keep the kind of trust element at the core of it and know like or the community element at the core of it and get to really engage with people as well outside of just how pretty or what hand-dyed yarn they're working with or how pretty something is they're working on, but also know why do they knit, or what do they value in knitting, and what interesting things are they doing. And so yeah, I think it reveals more. I don't feel like I have an answer of like how we can encourage more trust and community building within knitting online, because inherently like we're all talking to each other through a screen, and it's a different relationship. Of course it should be online versus in person, but still like it really matters to have that trust. And so how can we show more of it? And I don't really know. I mean, for me personally, I try to interact with everyone that I talk to. I try to, if I'm running a knit along, not have it be you have to buy this pattern or you have to knit with this yarn to participate. It's broader. And so I think that there are still ways that we can encourage people to more broadly engage in our community that don't require, buying the newest knitting pattern or buying a certain yarn type or certain aesthetics, like knit alongs that are, you know, just knit a pair of socks, or broader categories is a great idea that Karen Schaffer references as well, to build community and get to talk to people and not have it be you have to buy this pattern. Like a lot of mystery knit alongs where you have to buy the pattern to participate and you have to buy the yarns recommended to participate. Those are pay to play in some regards. They're still really fun, but it's pay to play. And so yeah, it's an interesting world that we live in online. I think that this situation with young men shows a lot of that world and kind of shows some of the problems. Of course, there's going to be bad faith actors in every community. So he's not like, this is everything that's wrong with knitting. It's also just like, he did some bad things and hopefully he learns from that. But I think it's worth considering how we can make our world kind of a little bit less transactional as we engage in the knitting community. So with that, I'm going to wrap it up because I think I'm getting a little rambly. And I am just so interested to hear what you all think of this. I think that the situation itself with young men is really interesting. So I'd love to hear your take on that. But broader, I want to hear what you think of the community versus the transactionality of knitting and social media. So thank you so much for watching, and thank you again to Fox and Fleece, to Karen Schaffer, to Woolfolk, and Hana Masujuska for their actions, for releasing these patterns and being good actors, and appreciate all of them so much. I highly recommend you read more, so I'll link all of the Reddit threads that I read through. I'll link the project that shares a lot of details about this. I will link Karen Schaffer's blog post as well. So I'll provide links for everything I can, and just want to say thank you for watching, and I'm really interested to hear what you all think. So please go comment down below. Okay, thank you all, and I will be back again on Sunday with a more traditional video. Okay, bye!